Good afternoon and welcome to this session on culturally safe libraries. My name is Barbara Lemon and I'm Executive Officer for National and State Libraries Australia, otherwise known as NSLA or NASLA. I'd like to begin, as others have, by acknowledging Australia's First Nations peoples as the traditional owners and custodians of the 5 very different lands from which we all join you today. In my case, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, on whose country I was born and raised and now live and work. Cultural safety in 30 minutes is a very challenging ask, but we're lucky to have 4 extraordinary panel speakers today, all of whom are very dear to me. Before introducing them formally, I want to acknowledge up front my non-Indigeneity in leading this conversation today. I'm an Australian of Scottish Highlander descent with a bit of Irish, English, Manx and Polish Jewish. It's pretty confusing, but I report to the 9 CEOs of NASLA libraries, also a group of non-Indigenous Australians. And I'm very lucky indeed to work with senior Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander library professionals in this program who are trusting me with the work, and I never take that for granted. So to introductions, Marcus Hughes is Director of Indigenous Engagement at the National Library of Australia and a proud descendant of the Mananjali peoples of the Yugambeh Nation. Patrick Gregory is Senior Director of Library and Archives NT up in Darwin in the top end and one of the 9 in the NASLA CEO group. Lesley is Program Officer Indigenous Services for State Library of Queensland and Project Officer with NASLA as well. She's a descendant of the Bidjirakari tribes and Budagal people of Budu Island in the Torres Strait. And Damien Webb is a Palawa man and manager of the Indigenous Engagement Branch at the State Library of New South Wales. He also represents NASLA on a new OCLC project on description of Indigenous collections, as well as many other roles across the sector. So this being a short session, we're unlikely to be able to take Q&A, but please do put your questions in and we'll do something with those at the end. That's a written article or a blog post through Alia. Before we start with questions, I think for our listeners or watchers today, it might be useful to have a brief bit of context around NASLA's Culturally Safe Libraries program, which is the reason we're here today. There is a link in the chat if you can find that. It's the top of this session. The program launched in 2018 as a joint investment from NASLA to build cultural competency across our 9 libraries. There are several layers to it. It finishes up this year formally. First up, development of national principles for cultural competency. Next is rollout of IATSIS core cultural learning online training for all staff, plus in-person debrief sessions. Third, delivery of an Indigenous collections workshop in each library by Lesley with local content as well as national content. And fourth, development of a suite of online resources for the GLAM sector based on the ATSI protocols. That's the link that you'll find in the chat. On top of this, all libraries taking part were expected to introduce local initiatives as needed, and we've designed an annual audit for the next 5 years to keep us accountable. That's it in a nutshell. And the good news story is that we've got nearly 2,000 staff through training. Our beautiful online resources have been visited over 10,000 times. Several libraries have new Indigenous identified positions, and we're very proud of that work. But what we didn't really account for at the beginning of this program, I think, is that changing the way we work means changing the way we think, and changing the way 2,500 people think is a hugely challenging task on a number of levels. So we're really here today to have a look under the hood with you and give you a bit of a warts and all account of the process, perhaps with the message that making our libraries culturally safe is as challenging as it is essential. So Marcus, if I could start with you as cab off the rank. We hear a lot of different terms in the sector: cultural safety, awareness, capability, competence. And I'm hoping you can untangle this a bit for us. You know, what language do you use and what does it mean to you as a leader?
Yeah, thank you, Barb, for such a simple question. And look, thank you for, again, your acknowledgement at the very beginning of this session. For me, I'm relatively new to the library sector, but I've been working in the GLAM sector for many years, and always working, I guess, to drive change, and that whole bit of business around legacy and how we move everyone forward. And I think in the prep kind of yarns we had around this session, especially with Damien and Lesley and Patrick, one of the things that becomes really evident, no matter what the language is that this is a really hard process and it's a really difficult process. And I was initially going to share a photograph of 5 of our old ones. But rather than do that and work with technology that always confuses me, I thought I'd just read the postscript that goes with it. And it is something that brings me great comfort in those periods of discomfort, and keeps me driving and moving forward. And the words are, when I wonder whether all of my efforts to stand up for the rights of my people are getting nowhere, I remind myself of our past generations who had no voice at all, but still remained immovable. And I think for me, that really is what keeps me moving forward in these periods of, you know, what's the language, what's the right word, what's the politic. I sit as an old one looking at the next generations, and often my heart breaks for them, because with our cultural obligation to leave legacy, to continue knowing that, you know, we are going to move on, but the work that we do, the way that we look after, and let's say country, impacts significantly on our future generations. And I look back at those old photos and I see the old ones and I see the strength and the beauty that's there. And then I come to conversations about, you know, what is capability, what is competence, what is training. And I guess what I have been lucky to see over the years, you know, sort of growing up as a young kid where Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people weren't counted in the census, to a position now where I see beautifully strong young ones like Damien and like Lesley taking the lead. You know, for me, I want to see that notion of capability really does translate into organisational competency, and they're two very, very different things. I might know how to drive a plane, but please don't put me behind that wheel, because I won't know what to do. And I think that's what we're seeing within the sector, is that the literacies are building, but there is danger within that space, that people are becoming more aware of the impacts on our communities. And when I say community, I'm talking about our colleagues working across the sector and in those institutions, and the ones that we are answerable to. We really do see those impacts that need to be managed. And again, to develop those structures that harness the literacy and continue for that to build and grow, so that we can move beyond the damage points that are potentially there. And as we always say, the missionaries were very well intentioned, but the disaster is huge, and we are living through those intergenerational traumas on a day-to-day basis, and things that are entering the language, you know, triggering. You know what I mean?
Yeah, so good intentions aren't enough. And I guess the difference between having the structures, maybe the tools and even the policies in place, as you say, but actually the gap between that and understanding. what to do with those.
Exactly. And we always, as a community, talk about the lived experience, and that's what informs it. What we need to, I guess, always consider is those people around us will never experience or understand what that lived experience is for us. But how does that become not so much their business, but their responsibility?
And could I ask you how you see, again, a big question for a short period of time, but how you see leadership or eldership in that, in moving an institution to something like cultural competency?
Yeah, look, it really is that thing around. I'm in a really privileged position. Lesley is in a privileged position. Damien is. We have the opportunity to speak truth to power. And we always have to do that with, maintaining our cultural authenticity, maintaining our cultural integrity, and maintaining that cultural authority within the space. And one of the things that has been really helpful for me is when my directorate have understood that in terms of community, it's not the director that will get speared. It's me. We become the face of the institution. We have to negotiate that relationship, and we have to be always two-way strong, and that becomes exhausting. When you're constantly having to explain why, and you can't actually ask the question of, well, why not? It becomes really, really challenging. So yeah, it becomes a whole bit of strategy. I mean, we go back to the relationship between Patyagrang and Dawes, She didn't just end up knocking on Dawes' tent to give him language. There must have been a much clearer strategy from her people that enables her to be there and gave her permission to be with this man, and for her to give him the Gadigal language. It doesn't just happen. There is clear, sophisticated strategy in the thinkings and the ways that we have to be strong, because if we don't, we waste the energies and we are not true to the commitments of our old ones over those thousands of generations.
Beautifully put. And I know that Patrick, as one of the 9 CEOs for NASLA Libraries, has been pondering those questions, particularly over the last 12 months. And I wonder if I could move to you, Patrick, as a leader, to talk a little bit about your experience in implementing this program, but in thinking about these issues that Marcus has raised at Library and Archives NT within that context.
Right. Thanks, Barb. Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be speaking to you this afternoon from the beautiful country of the Larrakia people. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and also to any First Nations people in the audience with us today. I think we're fortunate at Library and Archives NT in being a relatively small organisation in the NASLA context with about 40 FTE. It meant that we could go through the cultural safety program in 2 cohorts in a relatively concentrated space, and that really gave us a common sense of organisational discussion, a sense of an organisational learning together, and a common framework and platform for our discussions. I think it was really important to us that all of our leadership team went through the first cohort of that program, not only to demonstrate commitment to the program, but also to give us tools as a leadership team and the language, and to do some of our own learning so that we're able to support the wider organisation go through that. And I think one of the first learnings for us is that this isn't a project. It's not something that ever, cultural safety is not something that ever gets completed. It's not a box to tick or a series of competencies that you can say staff have got and you move on to the next thing. It's a change in organisational way of being. It's a different lens that you bring to all of your activities. And I guess, it is a culture change in the sense of, this is the way we do things around here. It's something that you do have to keep working on. About 10% of the staff here at Library and Archives NT are First Nations people. That's still a long way short of the 30% of the NT population, so we've got a lot of work to do in that area. But we've been having some very productive conversations. I think one of the challenges I've grappled with, and I'm sure others will talk about in the cultural labour more, and Marcus has touched on it, is how to give those staff the space to talk about any issues that they want to talk about and raise any issues they want to raise without making it their responsibility to solve those problems. It's not the job of First Nations staff, I think, to solve those problems within your organisation. That's your job as a leader to be doing that. It's not something that you can outsource. I do think cultural safety, I've talked about some of the challenges. It does rub up against some fairly deeply held views, I think, about librarianship, about library professional identity that can cause a bit of friction. And I guess one of the messages I'd also give is we really need to learn better how to sit with discomfort. We need to be able to listen and to be open to people expressing uncomfortable truths and sit with those truths and work with those conversations without leaping to immediate solutions or sidelining things. I think a lot of the people that work in libraries do so from, because they see libraries as an unproblematically good thing, that libraries are automatically on the side of the angels. And then when they hear that elements of the library services are not culturally safe, it can be taken very personally as an affront to professional identity. Touching on Marcus's point about good intentions, yeah, we think we have good intentions in libraries, but good intentions are not good enough. It needs to be more than that. And I think there's still a persistent myth of library neutrality, that somehow libraries themselves are neutral and apolitical, and that perhaps cultural safety is politicising the unpolitical. And I think if you think libraries are not political, then that's probably a sign of privilege in itself. They've grown out of a very specific political philosophy, particularly 19th century liberal individualism. And they do encode very specific forms of knowledge and power. The way they operate is not natural. And I think sometimes we've got a tendency to fall back on, well, that's just the way libraries do things, without doing the hard work about why do they do those things and why and how culturally specific are the ways that our library processes are set up. I'd say it's obviously very important to listen, but it's also very important to act. I think when First Nations visitors or staff or your advisory group or local communities tell you something, do something about it. I think often we can listen and say, I think that's a really great idea, or we just don't have the resources to do that at the moment. Actually, you do. I think what you're actually saying is that it's not a priority. I think if something's important enough, you will find the resources. And I think we really need to commit to action. And again, it gets back to good intentions and not enough. I have been talking a lot about challenges, but I do want to emphasise the benefits of the cultural safety program to us. I mean, the obvious benefit, of course, is making your organisation a safer place. But I think there's been other benefits along the way for all of our staff in doing this work. And I think fundamentally the conversations we've been having as an organisation have brought a widening of perspectives that actually makes our work more interesting and satisfying, and unpicks some of those assumptions that we've got about the way libraries do things, that actually leads to much richer conversations on a range of fronts. So going back to where I came in, I think at this point in time, we're sort of getting towards the end of the formal element of the program, but what's next? What does it look like as something that's embedded in our way of being? I think we've made some progress in some areas. In others, we've still got a long way to go. But what the cultural safety program, I think, has really done for us is started something that's there's no going back at this point. The ship has been launched, and we'll continue to work on that in an iterative fashion, an ongoing fashion. Yeah.
Absolutely agreed. Sort of kick the engine on it, and yeah, now we're on the road. So, Damien, Patrick touched on this concept of discomfort, sitting with discomfort, and that being part of good leadership, particularly in this area, being a necessary part of leadership in this area. And I wonder if you can sort of talk a little bit to what sorts of uncomfortable things may leaders need to be ready for, and what are the hidden human costs of a program like this?
Yeah, definitely. Where do we even start? I suppose to start with the irony that's not lost on me that this is an in-depth leadership session on cultural safety where I've got about 5 minutes. So we need to be careful of the language we use, and as everyone's already mentioned, the discomfort that we have been carrying as First Nation staff forever. I suppose libraries and the library sector is very good at creating managers and management structures. I am yet to see very many examples of leadership and leadership structures. And I think we kind of get confused around those two terms. Managers solve problems, they maintain systems, they minimize risk, but what do leaders do? Because that's not necessarily leadership, and it's definitely not for the Aboriginal clients and communities we work with, as a couple of people have already touched on. We will wear those ramifications. Libraries and non-Indigenous leaders talk about legacy, but they're never going to be cornered in the shops and called out over a decision that they weren't even aware that a library had made. And I think for me, it's very, very hard to get to the heart of it, because it is still quite distressing, I suppose. What this project has done is exposed a raw nerve that we've been aware of and trying to speak about for decades. The ATSLM protocols are 20, nearly 30 years old. And I think our leaders need to consider that the frustrations we hear, and in the feedback doing this project, of the onerous amounts of time, that it's a big ask, to ask staff to spend 10 hours unpacking the word that nobody really says anymore, but racism. We're talking about structural and fundamental racism that has been inherited, that has been perpetrated, and that leadership are petrified to talk about. So in Australia, we tend to talk about reconciliation, and we avoid these quite thorny issues. And for me, leaders will tackle that. We'll look at things like anti-racism training as the next step, that what we've established with this project is a baseline. And I think Marcus talks about it very well, that this is cultural literacy. This will never be a problem that is solved. This will always be an uncomfortable space. The generations that come after me will take issue with some of the language I've used and some of the approaches that I've had. First Nations will not be the preferred term in another 10 years. These things shift. And particularly in my experience over 10 years, managers and leaders in libraries are obsessed with finding a fix and putting it away and moving on to the next thing. This idea that you have to be and maintain your existence in a space that is very uncomfortable, that what we were asking people to do was not acquire new skills via training. We were asking them to literally unpack the very foundation of their values as people, as professionals, as library staff. There is no other training that asks staff to do that. There is no other context that I've seen where professionals are asked to really go back and unpack what does it mean to be a white Australian. How do you identify as a white man in a space? Have you ever been asked to? We are constantly and very used to identifying, to using our traumas and our cultural experiences as ways to give, I suppose, to delight and to inform our non-Indigenous leaders and colleagues, and maintaining that sense of delight and informing them and keeping them away from the trauma, because we don't want to burn out that limited opportunity we might have to speak on these issues, is a really challenging thing. I know an elder once overheard an elder talking to somebody who was asking, once again, that this elder give them that free cultural labour and walk them through, why is this a problem? What are libraries doing wrong? Can you take me on this journey? And she said, I'm not your cultural Sherpa. I've shown you the mountain. We've mapped this mountain dozens of times. You know the path through. You've got the resources. I'm not walking up that mountain again. I'm tired and I'm old and I'll wait for you at the bottom. But I'm not your cultural Sherpa. You cannot expect me to walk on paths we have built with exceptionally complex systems. ATSLM, decades of Aboriginal and First Nations library staff that have done this before. I think what's important to realise, I convene the Black Force Group, which is the NESLA Indigenous Staff Support Network. And over the course of this project, these staff have overwhelmingly reported that they feel less culturally safe during this project and have been required to undertake many hours of cultural labour to diffuse complex tensions, to make sure non-Aboriginal colleagues are comfortable with addressing things like the stolen generation. And we do that, and we know that part of our roles, and will always be part of our roles, is to chew your food for you, and we accept that. But I think there is a sense of hope that this project has given our colleagues a shared language and an insight into what we deal with professionally every day. And I would hope that they don't, that they resist the urge to run from that discomfort. Leadership means challenging the status quo and prioritising First Nations needs over your compliance, over your process. Compliance, process, these things can be changed if you have the will. All of these things were written and created at some point in time, and too often are we told that that's far too hard to do. Let's settle for a smaller step. And I think to see leaders nourishing our First Nations staff rather than just relying on us being resilient, because you hear resilience so many times, and it is a really fundamental aspect of our culture and the way that we work. But the reality is that those of us that weren't resilient are all dead. And I don't think that point is made often enough. You cannot expect resilience as an aspect of your First Nations staff. It should not be a requirement of work. You need to be looking to providing nourishment, because if that tank isn't filled up again, you'll burn out. And we obsess over things like attraction and retention of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander staff. And we should be looking at why they're leaving, why the average career of an Aboriginal person working in a library is half or a third of what non-Aboriginal people are doing. And it's because of these issues that burnout is there. And I think we need to look at why people aren't seeing us as a safe space to work in, and why when they do come in, they don't last as long.
I mean, there's so much there, and I think that burnout and resilience for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander staff is something that, well, I know Lesley has been very much confronted with at all sorts of levels, having that unique lens of being involved in the project at a national level and working on the ground, as it were, within State Library of Queensland, being the person I know who is approached by many people across the country, you know, to share those, to share their issues or to share their perspectives. So Lesley, I wondered if you could, you know, follow on there from Damien's comments with some observations from that position of having had the national and the state role within the program.
Thank you, Barb. Firstly, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the land where I meet today are the Turrbal and Yagara people, and also pay my respects to elders past, present and future, and also acknowledge the expertise of all the Indigenous staff who are with me today and who are also broadcasting and listening to this event. Yeah, Barb, doing two different roles has been challenging, but you know, in my early conversations with staff across the NASLA libraries as part of my national role, you know, I gauged a genuine willingness and determination from them to work collaboratively with First Nations staff and clients to strengthen cultural competency in their organisations. Some libraries admitted their work in this area had been minimal, but they were open and honest and accepted that there was a long journey ahead of them. But the gap has always been between words and action. A big part of the NASLA program is about reigniting our focus on the ATSI protocols. As Damien touched on before, you know, these protocols were developed in 1995. That's 25 years ago. And they were written by First Nations library staff to guide libraries, archives and information services to interact with First Nations peoples and communities, and to manage collection materials with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander content in a culturally appropriate way. So the work's already been done, but they haven't really been implemented widely or fully by libraries, and so their effectiveness has been minimised. I've observed some common barriers across the 9 libraries as we've rolled out this program. Difficulty in building visibility and staff engagement with the messages of the program, insufficient support from leadership and HR teams in some cases, and misunderstandings about why we're doing this training or having these conversations at all. But having said that, during the pandemic, staff at State Library of Queensland were able to undertake the training and digest the content from the comfort of their own homes. It wasn't easy to run debrief sessions in a virtual environment, but the chance to focus on the content helped, and I really observed people's receptiveness to the training through the online circles that I attended. But where they fell short was in translating what they learned into changed work practices while the thinking was fresh in their minds. It was the same for other libraries. In our first evaluation report for the NASLA program in November 2020, 59% of staff said they didn't know how to put their learnings into practice. They don't know what to do next. So it's made me realise the importance of introducing specific library strategies to build on staff learning straight away.
So Lesley, based on that, I guess, do you have recommendations for leaders to help move from that kind of rhetoric into action?
Definitely. Pretty straightforward things, really, like regular communication and progress reports from leaders to your staff about the Culturally Safe Libraries program. Start organising the face-to-face localised cultural training to build on the learnings from CORE. Having human resource teams access expert industry advice to manage Indigenous staffing issues, and having Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander workforce plans with strategies to employ and retain First Nation staff in senior levels. Update your style guides to reflect Indigenous protocols in all forms of media. Start delivery of anti-racism training. That is really needed. Meaningful and respectful engagement with First Nations communities about programs and services, but in timeframes aligned to cultural protocols. Mm-hmm. And importantly, embedding the ATSI protocols in collection management guidelines, policies and procedures. Because like Marcus and Damien have said, this is really about legacy. You know, I'd like to think that future generations can work in an organisation where they are respected, valued, and are safe to freely express their identity. Because, as I've said, as a nation, we can't move forward until the true history of how Australia was settled, knowing who the custodians are and how they cared for this continent for over 65,000 years is acknowledged, respected, and embedded in every institution.
Well, amen, Lesley. That's pretty well said. And I have to say those are four very hard-hitting and right on the knocker statements from each of you. And I wish we had 4 times the time. So I want to thank the panel, Marcus, Hughes, Lesley Akers, Patrick, Gregory and Damien Webb, so much for your time. And at the risk of being cut off, I wonder if you'll indulge me in finishing on a quote from James Baldwin, American writer James Baldwin in 1965, who wrote White Man's Guilt. And if we are cut off, I apologise, but it should take about 20 seconds. So here goes. White man, hear me. History, as nearly no one seems to know, is not merely something to be read and does not refer merely or even principally to the past. On the contrary, the great force of history comes from the fact that we carry it within us, are unconsciously controlled by it in many ways, and history is literally present in all that we do. It could scarcely be otherwise, since it is to history that we owe our frames of reference, our identities and our aspirations. And it is with great pain and terror that one begins to realise this. In great pain and terror, one begins to assess the history which has placed one where one is and formed one's point of view. In great pain and terror, because thereafter one enters into battle with that historical creation, oneself, with a capital O, and attempts to recreate oneself according to a principle more humane and more liberating. One begins the attempt to achieve a level of personal maturity and freedom which robs history of its tyrannical power and also changes history. So I thought perhaps we could end on that. Happy afternoon all.